Welcome to the hammock and my first ever video blog, or vlog as they're referred, and I entitled this one a blognik, with a play on words for beatniks that were from the 1950s. The beatnik was a term that it comes from the Beat Generation, and they were a group of people, young people, with a desire to live as they defined it, to live life as they defined it. And so the term beatnik was often stereotyped, unfortunately, for the beatnik generation, or the Beat Generation, with bongos, black turtlenecks. I managed the black, absolutely no turtleneck, and berets, but it was a very fascinating time in history for literary people like Jack Kerouac and others. So this particular blognik is to share some poetry readings with you. I've never been to a coffee house poetry reading. Always thought that would be a fascinating way to spend an evening, but I have not done that yet. So maybe I'll put that on my bucket list. But I thought I would spend a little time this evening honoring National Poetry Month, which was April, which I missed. But as far as I'm concerned, poetry should be any month of the year. And so I will share with you now some of my poetry, some poetry I love, some poetry written by others. But I thought I'd start with way back in history for me, with a love of poetry. Thanks to my mother, she saved just about everything from my childhood, so I have boxes and boxes of things. And I came across this particular little poem booklet. It must have been a class project. See if you can see it. Class of 83, which is interesting because I'm not the class of 83, but apparently I was. This was in 1983. So I would have been around 12 years old at the time. Do the math, you can figure out how old I am, that's fine, doesn't bother me. And it's full of classmates from my childhood. Many that I remember, many that I know well, even today, thanks to Facebook, and many that bring back very fond memories. But I wanted to share with you the poem that I wrote. It was a very tiny little short poem that I shared that was featured in our class poem book, and it was about poems, and it says, "Like a flower opening toward the sky, touching the hearts of everyone, verses." And so there was my contribution to this fabulous little poetry book back from 1983. My love of poetry has been with me for as long as I can remember, and my love of words, of course. I carried that over into the classroom when I was teaching in elementary level. Unfortunately, sadly, I don't think there's much of a focus on poetry or writing. There are, of course, writing focuses for passing those writing assessments that come along. But in terms of writing or writing poetry in particular, just for the love of the written word, I'm seeing it less and less in the classroom. But I know when I was there, it was one of my most favorite times of the day to sit down and write with my students. And in particular, poetry. And we often did poetry on Fridays in place of writing workshop. I have the wonderful, fabulous training that I received to thank for so much that I learned about sharing poetry and the love of writing and the love of words with young children in the classroom. So I wanted to share with you a couple of things, a couple of poems that were written by children, some poetic things that I shared in the classroom, and then sort of move forward in some things, some different poetry that I have to share. I'm in my bonus room. It's getting a little dark, so it's cloudy outside now, so I might have to lean in a minute and turn on a light behind the video camera. But I'll do that, hopefully without too much distraction. First thing I wanted to share, I just wanted to tell you about a couple of really neat books that are great to use for children or young students. This one is called Seeing the Blue Between, and it's a book for advice and inspiration for young poets. And I liked this particular poet's advice, a few thoughts that he offered. He says, "For a start, don't rhyme. We don't talk in rhyme. Why should we write that way? Write the way you talk. Think of the tone of voice in your poem. Is this the way you speak? Write about what you know. Sports, friends, parents, teachers, pets, teachers, pets. When you've written your poem, stand up and say it out loud. Work on how it sounds as well as how it reads. After all, Poetry is about words, both spoken and written, and good luck. And that's Stephen Herrick, and it's a poem that contributed to this, to the compilation of this book. So I liked what he had to say about poems not having to rhyme. I don't typically rhyme in my poems or try to make, turn the music down, make poems rhyme or match. I don't usually count the lyrics and count the meters and all of that sort of thing. I just usually just write them. Often my fridge poetry that I do is literally just on a whim, standing there at the fridge. I start playing with words and rearranging them. And what comes is what stays. I don't do a lot of editing of them either. Also wanted to share another fun little poem. This is another book. It's called A Jar of Tiny Stars. Poems by the NCTE award-winning poets. Children select their favorite poem. So this is a book of poems that children have selected and created a compilation of their favorites. This one I liked. It was called How to Eat a Poem. It says, don't be polite, bite in, pick it up with your fingers and lick the juice that may run down your chin. It is ready and ripe now wherever you are. You do not need a knife or a fork or a spoon or a plate or a napkin or a tablecloth, for there is no core or stem or rind or pit or seed or skin to throw away. So I thought that's an incredibly fun poem to share, especially if you're introducing a poem unit or a workshop for your students. I often try to find fun things to engage them. A couple of words of wisdom from some poets that are included in this book. This is a poet named David McCord, and he says, one of my teachers told me, never let a day go by without looking on 3 beautiful things. I try to live up to that and find it isn't difficult. The sky in all weathers is for me the first of these 3 things, and that is absolutely true for me as well. I often gaze at the sky, write about the sky, and the sky is often included in a lot of the things that I do write because it just serves as a perfect backdrop. Even a sky like today that's muffled gray can be a backdrop for the tone or a feel of a poem. And this is another sort of little advice or input from another poem. Her name is Eve Miriam, and she says, I've sometimes spent weeks looking for precisely the right word. It's like having a tiny marble in your pocket. You can just feel it. Sometimes you find a word and it says, no, I don't think this is it. Then you discard it and take another and another until you get it right. I do think poetry is great fun. That's what I'd like to stress more than anything else, the joy of the sounds of language. And that was written by Eve Miriam. So a couple of statements about poetry, some things that I wanted to share about poetry. I also wanted to move forward and show you a couple of things that are poems written by children before I get into poems that I've written or poems that I've selected. A couple of other things to share. When I did lead poetry workshops in my classroom with students, one of the things we had to do was create a poetry journal, a poetry notebook per se. And we often started with things like this, called a heart map. And so we would have to sketch in the back things that were important to us. And I'll show you mine, if you can see it. Okay, so this is what I drew. Okay, so you let the children spend some time just sketching things that are important to them, things that are on their hearts or central to their being, things that have affected them, things that they love, things that they remember. And it serves as a way to launch poetry in the future. So we do different things. A lot of the time the poetry journal is really just a way to collect poems, and so they can use during their poetry workstation that I would have in my classroom. They could collect poems out of poetry books, or maybe the poem of the week they would write in their poetry journal. One of the exercises that we like to do is to take a poem and then model it, almost mimic it exactly, but make it personal. This is a poem by George Ella Lyon called Where I'm From, and we take this poem and then make one about ourselves. I'll read you George's version, George Ella's version. It's called Where I'm From, and it says, I am from clothespins, from Clorox and carbon tetracyclide. I am from the dirt under the back porch. Black glistening, it tastes like beets. I'm from the forsythia bush, the Dutch elm, whose long-gone limbs I remember as if they were my own. I am from fudge and eyeglasses, from Imogene and Alifair. I'm from the know-it-alls and pass-it-ons, from perk up and pipe down. I'm from He restoreth my soul with a cotton ball lamb and 10 verses I can say myself. I'm from Artemis and Billy's branch, fried corn, strong coffee. From the finger my grandfather lost to the auger, the eye my father shut to keep his sight. Under my bed was a dress box spilling old pictures, a sift of